In the opening decades of the 19th century, Britain was a country shaped by the limits of muscle, wind, and water. Movement across the landscape followed patterns that had changed little for centuries. Most people lived close to where they were born, worked, and died, not from lack of curiosity, but because travel was slow, costly, and physically demanding. Distance was not measured only in miles, but in hours, days, and exhaustion. The rhythms of daily life were closely tied to the pace at which people and goods could move. For ordinary Britons, travel beyond the immediate locality was rare. Villages and towns were largely self-contained, relying on nearby farms, markets, and workshops. Roads existed, but their quality varied greatly. Some main routes were turnpike roads maintained by tolls, offering a relatively smooth surface for coaches and carts. Many others were little more than rutted tracks, muddy in winter and dusty in summer. Journeys were shaped by weather, daylight, and the condition of horses. A heavy rain could turn a planned trip into an ordeal or make it impossible altogether. The most common form of long-distance land travel for those who could afford it was the stagecoach. These coaches followed fixed routes between major towns, stopping at inns to change horses and allow passengers to rest. Travel by coach was uncomfortable and often unpredictable. Passengers endured cramped seating, cold, heat, and constant jolting. Accidents were not uncommon, especially at night or on poor roads. Even under good conditions, speeds were modest. A journey from London to Manchester could take several days, depending on the route and the season. For most working people, such travel was entirely out of reach. Walking remained the primary means of movement for the majority of the population. Laborers, artisans, and domestic servants walked to work, to market, to church, and to neighboring villages. Distances that might later seem trivial were significant when covered on foot, particularly after long hours of physical labor. The idea of commuting daily over many miles was almost unthinkable. Waterways offered an alternative means of transport, and for heavy goods they were often the most practical. Britain's rivers had long been used for trade, and from the late 18th century, an extensive network of canals had been constructed. These canals connected industrial regions with ports and cities, allowing coal, iron, grain, and manufactured goods to move more cheaply than by road. Barges were slow but reliable, drawn by horses along towpaths. For industry, canals represented a major improvement, but for personal travel, they played only a limited role. Passenger boats existed, but journeys were lengthy and uncomfortable, and routes were restricted to areas served by waterways. Time itself was experienced locally rather than nationally. Each town kept its own time, based on the position of the sun. Noon in Bristol was not the same moment as noon in London. For most people, this difference mattered little. Daily life was governed by natural light, church bells, and customary routines rather than precise clocks. Only a small number of people, such as merchants or officials coordinating over distance, needed to worry about exact timing. Even then, allowances were made for variation and delay. The cost of moving goods reflected these limitations. Food, fuel, and raw materials became more expensive the farther they had to travel. Fresh produce was usually consumed close to where it was grown. Coal fields supplied nearby towns more cheaply than distant ones. This helped shape regional economies and diets. People ate what could be produced or obtained locally, and industries developed where resources were close at hand. The idea of a truly national market existed in theory, but was constrained in practice by the difficulties of transport. Information traveled at a similar pace to people. News spread through letters, newspapers carried by coach, and word of mouth. A significant event in one part of the country might take days or weeks to be widely known elsewhere. This created a sense of separation between regions. Local identity was strong, and many people had only a vague awareness of places beyond their own county or neighboring areas. Britain was a single kingdom, but in daily experience it often felt like a collection of loosely connected local worlds. Social life reflected these patterns. Marriages, friendships, and working relationships were usually formed within a narrow geographical range. Visiting relatives in another town could require careful planning and expense. Seasonal fairs and markets provided occasional opportunities for wider contact, but these were limited in scope and duration. Travel for pleasure existed, particularly among the wealthy, who visited seaside resorts or spa towns, but it remained the exception rather than the rule. Even the state of the roads and the pace of travel influenced how people thought about space and time. Journeys were described in days rather than miles. A place was considered near or far based on effort, rather than distance on a map. Planning involved generous margins for delay. To set out was to accept uncertainty. This fostered patience and a certain acceptance of slowness as a normal part of life. By the early Victorian period, Britain was already undergoing profound economic and social change. Factories were expanding, cities were growing, and production was increasing. Yet the means of moving people and goods still relied on systems that struggled to keep pace with this transformation. The country stood on the edge of a shift that would alter not only transport, but the experience of time, distance, and daily life itself. The conditions of pre-railway Britain formed the foundation upon which a new network would soon be laid, reshaping the country in ways that were gradual, pervasive, and enduring. The arrival of the railway in Britain was not sudden, nor was it initially understood as a development that would transform everyday life. Early railways emerged from practical needs within specific industries rather than from a broad vision of national transport. In the late 18th and early 19th centuries, short stretches of track were used in mining districts to move coal from pits to canals or rivers. These early railways relied on wooden or iron rails and wagons pulled by horses. They were local, utilitarian, and largely invisible to those outside the industries they served. The transition from these modest beginnings to a nationwide railway system unfolded gradually. Technological improvements played a central role. Advances in iron production made stronger rails possible, while developments in steam power led to engines capable of pulling heavy loads over long distances. The work of engineers such as George Stephenson demonstrated that steam locomotives could be reliable, controllable, and economical. These early experiments did not immediately convince the public, but they provided a working model that others could observe and adapt. One of the first railways to attract widespread attention was the Stockton and Darlington Railway, opened in 1825. Although primarily intended for freight, it also carried passengers, marking a quiet departure from established patterns of travel. The railway proved that steam-powered transport could operate on a regular basis and at a scale larger than local industry. Its success encouraged further investment and experimentation, even as doubts and uncertainties remained. The Liverpool and Manchester Railway, opened in 1830, represented a more decisive step. Designed from the outset to carry both goods and passengers, it connected two major industrial centers and demonstrated the commercial potential of rail travel. The line's operation showed that railways could move people and freight more quickly and predictably than existing methods. This railway did not merely serve a local function. It suggested a new way of linking regions and supporting economic activity across wider areas. Public reaction to these early railways was mixed and often cautious. Many people viewed the new technology with suspicion. There were concerns about safety, noise, and disruption to the landscape. Some feared that fast movement would be harmful to health, while others worried about the impact on traditional trades such as coaching and horse breeding. Landowners sometimes resisted the construction of lines across their estates, leading to disputes and legal challenges. Parliament became the arena in which many of these conflicts were negotiated, as railway companies sought permission to build their routes. Despite these reservations, railway construction accelerated during the 1830s and 1840s. This period saw a surge of investment known as the railway boom. Capital flowed into new companies, surveys were conducted across the country, and plans were drawn up to link cities, ports, and industrial regions. Not all of these schemes were successful, and some were based on overly optimistic expectations. Nonetheless, the overall effect was the rapid expansion of the railway network. The process of building railways brought visible change to both rural and urban landscapes. Embankments, cuttings, tunnels, and bridges appeared where none had existed before. Construction sites employed large numbers of laborers, often drawn from other regions. Their presence introduced new patterns of temporary settlement and work. While the finished railways would eventually blend into daily life, during their construction they were a striking and sometimes unsettling presence. As lines opened, the experience of rail travel began to spread. Stations became new points of arrival and departure, often located at the edges of towns or in newly developed areas. These stations were practical structures at first, designed to manage goods and passengers efficiently. Over time, they also became places of social interaction, where different classes and occupations encountered one another in shared spaces. The early railway companies operated independently, each setting its own timetables, fares, and rules. This lack of standardization reflected the experimental nature of the industry. Services were adjusted through trial and error as companies learned how to balance speed, capacity, and safety. Accidents did occur, particularly in the early years, but they also prompted improvements in signaling, braking, and track design. Gradually, a body of shared practice emerged, shaping how railways were built and operated. For many people, the first encounter with a train was memorable, though not always immediately transformative. Early passengers experienced unfamiliar sensations: the steady rhythm of wheels on rails, the confined space of carriages, and the unfamiliar speed. Journeys that had once taken a full day by coach could now be completed in a matter of hours. Even so, this change did not instantly alter habits or expectations. Rail travel was initially more expensive than other forms of transport, and its benefits were most accessible to those with means. The spread of railways across Britain followed patterns shaped by geography, industry, and investment. Lines connected coal fields to factories, ports to manufacturing centers, and major cities to one another. Smaller towns were drawn into the network over time, sometimes after prolonged debate about costs and benefits. The map of Britain began to change as routes multiplied, though large areas remained untouched in the early stages. By the middle of the 19th century, railways were no longer a novelty confined to a few routes. They had become a visible and growing presence in British life. Yet their full implications were not immediately clear. The railway was still understood primarily as a practical improvement, a faster way to move goods and people. Only gradually would it become apparent that this new mode of transport was reshaping how Britons understood distance, organized time, and related to one another across the country. The arrival of the railway marked the beginning of a process rather than a completed transformation. It introduced a system that would continue to evolve, expand, and influence daily life in ways that reach far beyond the tracks themselves. One of the most far-reaching effects of the railway was its quiet alteration of how time and distance were understood in Britain. This change did not occur through formal announcements or deliberate instruction. It emerged gradually as people adjusted their habits to the demands and possibilities of rail travel. Over time, the railway reshaped not only how far people could go, but how they thought about when things happened and how precisely moments were measured. Before the railways, time had been local and flexible. Each town set its clocks according to the sun, and small differences between places were accepted without concern. Daily schedules were approximate rather than exact. Work began at customary hours, markets opened in the morning, and travel allowances were made for delay. Precision was neither expected nor required for most activities. The arrival of the railway disrupted this arrangement by introducing systems that depended on coordination across distance. Trains could not operate efficiently if each station followed its own local time. Even small discrepancies created confusion in timetables and increased the risk of accidents. As rail services expanded, railway companies began to standardize time along their lines. The most influential of these was London time, based on the Greenwich meridian. By the 1840s, many railway companies were using what became known as railway time, setting clocks in stations and offices to a single standard. This practice gradually spread beyond the railways themselves. Towns served by rail lines began to adjust their public clocks to match railway time, recognizing its practical advantages. Church clocks, town halls, and factories followed suit. By 1880, standardized time was legally established across Britain. This shift was not driven by abstract scientific reasoning alone, but by the everyday need to make trains run safely and reliably. In adapting to the railway, society adopted a more uniform and exact approach to time. Alongside this standardization came a heightened awareness of punctuality. Trains ran to timetables that were printed, distributed, and consulted. To miss a train was no longer a minor inconvenience, but a measurable failure to align with a fixed schedule. This encouraged new habits. People learned to arrive early, to watch clocks, and to plan their movements with greater care. The expectation of punctuality extended gradually into workplaces, schools, and appointments, reinforcing the railway's influence beyond the station. Distance was also redefined. Places that had once seemed remote became accessible within a day or even a few hours. The effort of travel was reduced, and with it the sense of separation between regions. A journey that had required an overnight stop by coach could now be completed without leaving the carriage. This did not eliminate the experience of distance, but it changed its character. Distance became something that could be measured in time and fare rather than fatigue and uncertainty. The railway timetable played a central role in this transformation. It presented space as a series of intervals, each marked by arrival and departure times. To read a timetable was to see the country arranged in a new way, as a network of connections rather than a sequence of arduous journeys. This encouraged a more abstract understanding of geography, one that could be grasped through printed schedules and maps as well as physical experience. For businesses, these changes were particularly significant. The ability to predict delivery times with greater accuracy improved planning and coordination. Manufacturers could schedule production more tightly, knowing when raw materials would arrive and finished goods could be dispatched. Merchants could communicate more effectively with suppliers and customers in other towns. The railway did not remove all uncertainty, but it reduced it enough to support more complex forms of organization. Individuals also adapted their expectations. Visiting relatives in another city became a matter of consulting a timetable rather than embarking on an expedition. The language used to describe travel shifted accordingly. Journeys were discussed in hours and minutes rather than days. This change filtered into everyday speech and thought, reinforcing the railway's influence on perception as well as practice. The experience of speed itself contributed to these shifts. Although early trains were slow by later standards, they were markedly faster than road travel. This created a sense of compression, as landscapes passed more quickly and the transition between places felt less gradual. The countryside became something to be observed in passing, rather than traversed step by step. While this did not diminish attachment to place, it altered the way movement through space was experienced. The railway also encouraged regularity. Services operated at fixed times, repeating daily or weekly. This repetition created rhythms that people could rely on. Market days, work shifts, and social visits were increasingly aligned with train schedules. Over time, this regularity contributed to a more structured pattern of daily and weekly life, particularly in towns connected by frequent services. It is important to note that these changes were not uniform or immediate. Rural areas without rail connections retained older habits for longer, and not everyone adjusted at the same pace. Some people continued to set their clocks by local time well into the later 19th century. Others resisted the growing emphasis on punctuality, finding it restrictive. Nonetheless, the overall direction of change was clear. The railway introduced a framework within which time and distance were increasingly standardized and coordinated. By reshaping how Britons measured hours and understood miles, the railway altered the mental landscape of the country. It encouraged a view of Britain as a connected whole, structured by schedules and shared reference points. These changes laid the groundwork for further transformations in work, industry, and daily life, as the new understanding of time and distance became embedded in the routines of an industrial society. One of the most far-reaching effects of the railway was its quiet alteration of how time and distance were understood in Britain. This change did not occur through formal announcements or deliberate instruction. It emerged gradually, as people adjusted their habits to the demands and possibilities of rail travel. Over time, the railway reshaped not only how far people could go, but how they thought about when things happened and how precisely moments were measured. Before the railways, time had been local and flexible. Each town set its clocks according to the sun, and small differences between places were accepted without concern. Daily schedules were approximate rather than exact. Work began at customary hours, markets opened in the morning, and travel allowances were made for delay. Precision was neither expected nor required for most activities. The arrival of the railway disrupted this arrangement by introducing systems that depended on coordination across distance. Trains could not operate efficiently if each station followed its own local time. Even small discrepancies created confusion in timetables and increased the risk of accidents. As rail services expanded, railway companies began to standardize time along their lines. The most influential of these was London time, based on the Greenwich meridian. By the 1840s, many railway companies were using what became known as railway time, setting clocks in stations and offices to a single standard. This practice gradually spread beyond the railways themselves. Towns served by rail lines began to adjust their public clocks to match railway time, recognizing its practical advantages. Church clocks, town halls, and factories followed suit. By 1880, standardized time was legally established across Britain. This shift was not driven by abstract scientific reasoning alone, but by the everyday need to make trains run safely and reliably. In adapting to the railway, society adopted a more uniform and exact approach to time. Alongside this standardization came a heightened awareness of punctuality. Trains ran to timetables that were printed, distributed, and consulted. To miss a train was no longer a minor inconvenience, but a measurable failure to align with a fixed schedule. This encouraged new habits. People learned to arrive early, to watch clocks, and to plan their movements with greater care. The expectation of punctuality extended gradually into workplaces, schools, and appointments, reinforcing the railway's influence beyond the station. Distance was also redefined. Places that had once seemed remote became accessible within a day or even a few hours. The effort of travel was reduced, and with it the sense of separation between regions. A journey that had required an overnight stop by coach could now be completed without leaving the carriage. This did not eliminate the experience of distance, but it changed its character. Distance became something that could be measured in time and fare rather than fatigue and uncertainty. The railway timetable played a central role in this transformation. It presented space as a series of intervals, each marked by arrival and departure times. To read a timetable was to see the country arranged in a new way, as a network of connections rather than a sequence of arduous journeys. This encouraged a more abstract understanding of geography, one that could be grasped through printed schedules and maps as well as physical experience. For businesses, these changes were particularly significant. The ability to predict delivery times with greater accuracy improved planning and coordination. Manufacturers could schedule production more tightly, knowing when raw materials would arrive and finished goods could be dispatched. Merchants could communicate more effectively with suppliers and customers in other towns. The railway did not remove all uncertainty, but it reduced it enough to support more complex forms of organization. Individuals also adapted their expectations. Visiting relatives in another city became a matter of consulting a timetable rather than embarking on an expedition. The language used to describe travel shifted accordingly. Journeys were discussed in hours and minutes rather than days. This change filtered into everyday speech and thought, reinforcing the railway's influence on perception as well as practice. The experience of speed itself contributed to these shifts. Although early trains were slow by later standards, they were markedly faster than road travel. This created a sense of compression, as landscapes passed more quickly and the transition between places felt less gradual. The countryside became something to be observed in passing, rather than traversed step by step. While this did not diminish attachment to place, it altered the way movement through space was experienced. The railway also encouraged regularity. Services operated at fixed times, repeating daily or weekly. This repetition created rhythms that people could rely on. Market days, work shifts, and social visits were increasingly aligned with train schedules. Over time, this regularity contributed to a more structured pattern of daily and weekly life, particularly in towns connected by frequent services. It is important to note that these changes were not uniform or immediate. Rural areas without rail connections retained older habits for longer, and not everyone adjusted at the same pace. Some people continued to set their clocks by local time well into the later 19th century. Others resisted the growing emphasis on punctuality, finding it restrictive. Nonetheless, the overall direction of change was clear. The railway introduced a framework within which time and distance were increasingly standardized and coordinated. By reshaping how Britons measured hours and understood miles, the railway altered the mental landscape of the country. It encouraged a view of Britain as a connected whole, structured by schedules and shared reference points. These changes laid the groundwork for further transformations in work, industry, and daily life, as the new understanding of time and distance became embedded in the routines of an industrial society. As railways extended across Britain, their influence on cities, towns, and the movement of people became increasingly visible. The railway did not simply serve existing settlements, it reshaped them, altering patterns of growth and redefining relationships between urban and rural areas. These changes emerged over decades, gradually integrating the railway into the physical and social fabric of the country. Large cities were among the earliest and most obvious beneficiaries of rail connections. Lines were drawn toward established centers of population, commerce, and industry, reinforcing their importance. London, already the largest city in Britain, became the focal point of an expanding web of rail routes. Trains radiated outward, linking the capital to regional cities such as Birmingham, Manchester, Leeds, and Bristol. This strengthened London's role as a hub of administration, finance, and trade, while also making it more accessible to people from across the country. Regional cities also grew in significance as railway junctions and termini. Their ability to receive raw materials and distribute finished goods improved, supporting industrial expansion. Rail access made these cities more attractive to employers and workers alike, contributing to population growth. As industries expanded, housing was built to accommodate new residents, often at a rapid pace. The shape and density of urban areas were influenced by the placement of railway lines and stations, which became anchors for development. Smaller towns experienced more varied effects. For some, a railway connection brought renewed prosperity. Market towns that had once served a limited hinterland could now draw customers and traders from a wider area. Agricultural producers gained access to urban markets, while local businesses benefited from increased foot traffic. The arrival of a railway station often stimulated building activity, with new streets, shops, and services emerging nearby. Other towns were less fortunate. Places bypassed by main lines sometimes found themselves at a disadvantage as trade and movement shifted toward rail-connected centers. Over time, this could lead to stagnation or decline, particularly if alternative industries or transport links were not available. The railway thus contributed to a reordering of the urban hierarchy, favoring some settlements while leaving others relatively isolated. The movement of people within and between towns also changed. Railways made it easier for individuals to relocate in search of work. Young men and women from rural areas traveled to industrial towns and cities, drawn by employment opportunities. While migration had long been part of British life, the railway increased its scale and speed. Journeys that might once have been undertaken only once in a lifetime became more manageable, encouraging greater mobility. Within cities, the railway influenced patterns of residence. As commuting became possible for a growing number of people, residential areas began to spread outward from city centers. Suburbs developed along rail lines, offering housing away from industrial districts. This process was gradual and initially limited to those who could afford regular fares, but it marked a shift in how urban space was used. The separation of home and workplace became more pronounced, changing daily routines and social interactions. The railway also affected seasonal movement. Temporary travel for work, such as agricultural labor or construction, became more feasible. People could travel to where labor was needed and return home more easily. This flexibility altered traditional patterns of local employment and contributed to a more dynamic labor market. Rail travel supported the growth of new towns as well. Some settlements emerged primarily because of their position on the railway network. Junctions and stops became centers of activity, attracting residents, businesses, and services. These railway towns often developed quickly, shaped by the needs of transport and trade rather than long-established traditions. Their layout and character reflected their origins, with streets and buildings oriented toward the station. The movement of people was not limited to workers. Families used the railway to maintain connections across distance, visiting relatives or relocating together. Institutions such as schools, hospitals, and religious organizations also benefited from improved transport, extending their reach and influence. Over time, these movements contributed to a gradual mixing of regional populations, though local identities remained strong. The physical presence of the railway altered landscapes within towns and cities. Tracks, stations, bridges, and yards occupied significant space, sometimes dividing neighborhoods or replacing existing structures. These changes could be disruptive, but they also created new focal points. Stations became gateways to towns, shaping first impressions and serving as landmarks. Their design and scale often reflected civic pride and commercial ambition. By linking settlements and facilitating movement, the railway encouraged a more interconnected society. Cities and towns were no longer defined solely by their immediate surroundings, but by their position within a wider network. This network influenced where people lived, worked, and traveled, gradually reshaping the geography of Britain. The effects were uneven and complex, but they marked a lasting shift in how population and place were related in the Victorian era. As railways became a regular feature of British life, their influence extended into everyday habits and routines. These changes were often subtle, unfolding through ordinary activities rather than dramatic events. Over time, the railway altered how people shopped, relaxed, socialized, and organized their leisure, gradually reshaping daily experience across different classes and regions. Shopping was one area where the effects of improved transport were clearly felt. Railways allowed goods to be moved more quickly and reliably between producers and consumers. Urban shops gained access to a wider range of products, including items manufactured or grown far from the point of sale. This expanded choice for customers and encouraged the growth of larger retail establishments. Department stores and chain shops benefited from the ability to stock goods sourced from across the country, while smaller retailers adapted by specializing or aligning themselves with new supply patterns. Markets, which had long been central to local trade, also changed. While they remained important social and economic spaces, their role was influenced by the availability of rail transport. Perishable goods could reach towns more frequently, reducing reliance on local production alone. Shoppers encountered foods and materials that were no longer strictly seasonal or regional, contributing to gradual changes in diet and domestic consumption. Leisure and recreation were similarly affected. Before the railways, leisure travel was limited and often confined to local outings or extended journeys undertaken only occasionally. The railway made short trips more practical, allowing people to travel to neighboring towns, countryside locations, or coastal areas for a day or a weekend. This supported the growth of organized leisure activities, such as excursions arranged by employers, religious groups, or social organizations. Seaside resorts provide a clear example of this development. Towns that were once accessible mainly to the wealthy began to attract a broader range of visitors as rail lines reached the coast. Day trips to the seaside became possible for working and lower middle-class families, particularly during designated holidays. These visits followed regular patterns shaped by train schedules, embedding leisure within the rhythms established by rail transport. Holidays themselves were influenced by the railway. While extended holidays remained limited for much of the population, the concept of taking time away from work for rest and recreation became more established. The ability to travel efficiently encouraged employers to recognize certain holidays and facilitated collective travel during these periods. Over time, this contributed to more predictable patterns of leisure and rest. Social routines also adjusted to the presence of railways. Visiting friends and relatives over distance became easier, supporting the maintenance of family ties even as people moved away from their place of birth. Social engagements could be planned with greater confidence, knowing when trains would arrive and depart. This reinforced the importance of timetables in everyday planning, extending their influence beyond work and commerce. The railway affected how people experienced public space. Stations, platforms, and waiting rooms became part of daily life for many, introducing shared environments where individuals from different backgrounds gathered. These spaces had their own customs and expectations, shaped by the need for order and coordination. The experience of waiting, boarding, and traveling together contributed to a sense of collective participation in a common system. Printed materials associated with rail travel also entered everyday life. Timetables, tickets, and notices required reading and interpretation, encouraging practical literacy and familiarity with schedules. Newspapers benefited from faster distribution, allowing readers to receive news from distant places more promptly. This supported a growing sense of connection to national events and discussions, even as daily routines remained grounded in local experience. Domestic life was influenced indirectly by these changes. The availability of new goods and the possibility of travel affected household planning and aspirations. Furnishings, clothing, and household items reflected broader trends as materials and designs circulated more widely. While such changes were uneven and often gradual, they contributed to a shared material culture shaped in part by rail transport. It is important to recognize that these shifts did not affect everyone equally. Cost, location, and occupation influenced who could take advantage of rail travel and new consumer opportunities. Rural populations without nearby stations experienced fewer changes, and for many working people, daily routines remained physically demanding and constrained. Nevertheless, the presence of the railway established new possibilities that gradually filtered through society. By embedding itself in ordinary activities, the railway became more than a means of transport. It provided a framework within which shopping, leisure, and social life were reorganized. These adjustments were rarely noticed as they occurred, yet over time they contributed to a transformation in how everyday life was structured and experienced in Victorian Britain. The spread of railways across Victorian Britain also brought gradual social change, shaping relationships between classes, influencing patterns of behavior, and prompting new forms of regulation. These developments were not driven by a single intention or reform movement. Instead, they emerged from the practical challenges of managing a system that brought large numbers of people into shared spaces and carried them across long distances under common rules. One of the most noticeable social effects of railway travel was the increased contact between different social groups. Before the railways, travel tended to separate people by class, with private carriages, coaching inns, and modes of transport reflecting social distinctions. Railways retained class divisions through different ticket prices and carriage types, yet they also created environments in which people of varying backgrounds traveled within the same system. Platforms, waiting rooms, and stations were shared spaces where distinctions were present but less absolute. This proximity did not erase social hierarchies, but it did alter how they were experienced. Behavior in railway spaces was governed by rules designed to maintain order and efficiency. Passengers were expected to queue, to follow instructions, and to respect schedules regardless of social status. These expectations encouraged a form of public discipline that applied broadly across classes. Over time, such habits became familiar and accepted, influencing conduct in other public settings. Railways also contributed to social mobility in a practical sense. By making movement easier, they allowed people to seek education, employment, and opportunity beyond their immediate locality. This did not guarantee advancement, but it expanded the range of possible paths. Clerks, teachers, and skilled workers could relocate or commute, shaping careers that were less constrained by birthplace. While class structures remained deeply rooted, the railway provided tools that could be used to navigate them. The need to manage large numbers of passengers safely and efficiently led to new forms of regulation. Railway companies developed rules governing ticketing, luggage, behavior, and access to platforms. These rules were communicated through signs, printed notices, and staff instructions. Compliance was expected, and enforcement was generally firm but procedural rather than personal. This contributed to a broader culture of regulated public life. Safety concerns played a role in shaping these systems. As rail travel became more common, the importance of preventing accidents and maintaining order grew. Signaling systems, timetables, and staffing practices were refined over time. Although serious incidents occurred, they also prompted improvements in oversight and standardization. Government involvement increased gradually, with legislation addressing issues such as track standards, working conditions, and passenger safety. The railway workforce itself became a focus of social organization. Railway employees often worked long hours under demanding conditions, particularly in the early years. Over time, they formed associations to represent their interests and negotiate with employers. These organizations reflected broader trends in Victorian labor relations, shaped by industrial growth and the need to balance efficiency with welfare. Railway companies, as large and visible employers, played a role in setting precedents for employment practices. Moral and social reform movements also took an interest in the railway. Concerns were raised about behavior in stations and carriages, particularly where men and women traveled together or where alcohol was available. Efforts were made to promote orderly conduct, cleanliness, and propriety. Separate waiting rooms and carriages were sometimes provided to address these concerns. Such measures reflected prevailing social attitudes as well as practical considerations. The railway influenced patterns of policing and supervision. Stations required staff to manage crowds, prevent theft, and respond to disputes. This introduced new forms of authority within public spaces, exercised through uniforms, procedures, and defined responsibilities. Passengers became accustomed to the presence of officials who were neither purely private nor fully governmental, contributing to a changing understanding of public order. Education and information were also affected. The circulation of newspapers, books, and pamphlets increased as rail transport reduced delivery times. Ideas, debates, and reform campaigns could reach wider audiences more quickly. While this did not depend solely on the railway, Improved transport supported a more connected public sphere, in which discussions extended beyond local boundaries. These social changes were cumulative rather than revolutionary. The railway did not overturn existing structures, but it modified how they operated. It introduced shared systems, common expectations, and regulated environments that shaped everyday interactions. Through these mechanisms, the railway contributed to a gradual adjustment in social life, aligning behavior and organization with the demands of a more mobile and interconnected society. By the end of the Victorian period, the railway had become an established and largely unquestioned part of British life. What had once been a novel and uncertain technology was now woven into the country's physical layout, economic systems, and daily routines. Its long-term legacy lay not in any single change, but in the cumulative effects of decades of adaptation. The railway reshaped Britain in ways that continued to influence society long after the initial period of expansion had passed. One of the most enduring legacies of the railway was the creation of a permanently connected nation. Rail lines linked cities, towns, ports, and industrial regions into a single network through which people, goods, and information moved with relative ease. This network reduced regional isolation and encouraged a shared sense of participation in national life. While local identities remained important, they existed within a framework of regular contact and exchange that the railway made possible. The physical landscape of Britain was also permanently altered. Cuttings, embankments, tunnels, bridges, and stations became fixed features of the environment. Many of these structures were built to last and continued to shape movement and development long after the Victorian era. Towns and cities grew around railway infrastructure, and patterns of settlement reflected the roots laid down during the 19th century. Even where lines later fell out of use, their imprint remained visible in street layouts and land use. The railway's influence on economic organization proved equally lasting. By supporting large-scale industry, national markets, and complex supply chains, it helped establish patterns of production and distribution that persisted into the 20th century. The expectation that goods could be delivered reliably over distance became embedded in commercial planning. This assumption underpinned later developments in manufacturing, retail, and logistics, extending the railway's influence beyond its immediate period. Work and employment continued to reflect structures shaped by rail transport. The separation of home and workplace, the regularity of working hours, and the emphasis on punctuality became standard features of modern life. These practices were not created by the railway alone, but the railway provided the practical means through which they could be sustained across distance. In this way, transport and social organization became closely aligned. The standardization of time stands as one of the railway's most significant contributions. The adoption of a single national time enabled coordination across regions and sectors. This uniformity supported not only rail travel, but also communication, administration, and commerce. Over time, precise timekeeping became an ordinary expectation rather than a specialized requirement. Clocks, schedules, and deadlines became integral to daily life, reflecting habits first reinforced by railway operation. Cultural perceptions of space and movement were also reshaped. The idea that one could travel considerable distances within a day became normal. Journeys were planned with confidence rather than caution. The mental map of Britain changed, as places were understood in terms of connections and travel times rather than remoteness. This altered how people thought about opportunity, belonging, and reach, even if their own movements remained limited. The railway also left a legacy of institutional practice. Large railway companies demonstrated methods of managing complex systems through standardized procedures, hierarchies, and record-keeping. These approaches influenced other industries and public bodies, contributing to the development of modern organizational forms. The experience of coordinating trains, staff, and passengers across wide areas provided models that could be adapted to other forms of large-scale enterprise. Social habits shaped during the railway age continued to influence behavior. Queuing, adherence to schedules, and compliance with public rules became familiar aspects of shared life. Public spaces designed for movement and waiting were accepted as normal. These habits extended beyond the railway itself, shaping expectations in other areas of transport and civic activity. It is important to recognize that the railway's legacy was not static. As new technologies emerged, including motor vehicles and later forms of transport, the role of the railway evolved. Yet these developments built upon foundations laid during the Victorian period. Roads were improved, cities expanded, and industries adapted within a landscape already structured by rail connections. The railway provided a framework within which subsequent change occurred. In retrospect, the significance of the railway lies in its quiet persistence. It did not merely serve the Victorian era and then fade into history. Instead, it established patterns of movement, organization, and perception that became part of the underlying structure of modern Britain. The rhythms of daily life, the organization of work, and the sense of national connection all bore the imprint of the railway long after its early years. Through steady integration rather than sudden transformation, the railway reshaped Britain's relationship with space, time, and society. Its legacy endures not as a dramatic episode, but as a lasting framework that continues to influence how the country functions and how its people experience the world around them.